The language of creation, cosmic symbolism in Genesis. A commentary, Matthìeu Pageau. Introduction. As our technological knowledge distances us from nature, we find it increasingly difficult to reconcile the current scientific worldview with the biblical worldview. I have written this commentary to provide the reader with the necessary tools to interpret the Bible from its own cosmological perspective instead of the materialistic paradigms of modern science. In the first section, I discuss the difference between scientific and traditional cosmologies, as well as the importance of rediscovering the ancient biblical worldview. This is followed by a brief commentary on the first day of creation with a focus on the cosmic duality called heaven and earth. The practical implications of this duality are then examined in the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and Noah. In the second half of this commentary, I examine the first 3 days of creation and the concepts of space and time as understood in the ancient cosmology. I review the early stories of Genesis and discuss the implications of the concepts at the level of human experience. Finally, I revisit the difference between materialistic and traditional worldviews in light of the information present in this commentary. Part 1. Salvaging creation from the scientific worldview. Chapter 1. Spiritual and material perspectives. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Unlike modern science, traditional cosmology did not attempt to describe reality in terms of atoms, energy, and mechanical causality. Instead, most ancient cultures perceived the world in terms of spiritual principles such as angels, demons, and mysterious sea monsters at the age of the world. So before attempting to interpret a book like Genesis, it is important to understand why our current worldview is so different from that of the past. Spiritual perspective. What does it mean? What trust does it embody? Material perspective. How does it work? What material is it made of? As illustrated above, scientific traditional cosmologies see reality from two completely different perspectives. One in terms of its practical of the material implications, and two in terms of its high meaning. The first is the specialty of modern science, which conceptualizes all things in terms of meaningless matter and mindless causality. The second is the specialty of religion, which interprets every phenomenon as a manifestation of spiritual trust. When interpreted reality, each of the worldviews raises its own types of questions. For example, when looking at the planet from a material perspective, one might ask the following questions. What is the planet made of? And how does it work? However, when looking at the same planet from a spiritual perspective, one might ask the following questions. What is the meaning of this planet? And what higher trust does it embody? Not surprisingly, these questions have little or nothing in common, which demonstrate that the distinct nature of the world views. That said, the goal of this commentary is not bridge the gaps between the material and spiritual perspectives, but to rediscover the lost spiritual worldview and to interpret the Bible accordingly. For that purpose, we must learn how to look at the world from a different point of view, to see really not as a heap of meaningless atoms and energy, but as the physical expression of metaphysical truth. Chapter 2. Coming full circle, the Copernican revolution. God exiled him, the human, from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which they was taken. The spiritual and material perspective have always been in competition because they are fundamentally different. Nevertheless, since neither of their worldview has successfully subsumed the other, they have learned to coexist and even cooperated in the past. However, a series of important scientific discoveries have dealt a fatal blow to the spiritual worldview, one from which it has never recovered. Genesis, heliocentric. The scientific discoveries illustrated above were not merely technical in nature, they transformed our concepts of space-time and causality. Ultimately, their discoveries completely undermined the foundation of traditional metaphysics. Therefore, when these changes were taking place during the Copernican revolution, the stakes were much higher than merely defending geocentrism against heliocentrism. They were also about preserving the spiritual perspective from a more completely materialistic worldview. From scientific standpoint, it will be difficult to justify and attempt to cover up discoveries in order to preserve a debunked model of the universe. However, from a biblical perspective, this seems like a proper response to the tragedy of the fall in Genesis. Losing the spiritual perspectives, paraphrased from Genesis 2:3, God said to Adam, "From the tree of the knowledge of good and bad you must not eat, for you will die on the day that you eat from it." They are its fruit, and their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves girdleless. God existed the human from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. The reason to preserve biblical cosmology against scientific hegemony is that it describes reality at the metacognitive level. Hence, the story of the fall is really about the process of knowledge itself and the dangers of acquiring greater material knowledge at the expense of spiritual insight. So, by comparing the diagram below to the previous one, it is easy to understand why the Copernican revolution may be interpreted as a reiteration of the narrative of that fall. In the garden, eyes opened, wandering in exile. The story of the Garden of Eden describes a state of innocence where humans occupied a central place in a relatively natural environment. This naive perspective conveniently provided humans with a full understanding of their role in the universe and the spiritual purpose of existence. However, the garden was also a sheltered place. It was a tiny portion of a much greater world. Therefore, as soon as humans looked beyond the limits of the garden, their eyes were opened to a strange universe devoid of spiritual meaning. They knew that they were naked, and saw their previous worldview as somewhat illusory. Once the bubble had been shattered, all attempts at covering it up were in vain, and humans had no choice but to wander in a meaningless universe until they returned to the ground. At the metacognitive level, the narrative of the fall perspective masses the pleiad of humanity since the scientific revolution. So, even though their technical discoveries have locally debunked traditional cosmology, they have ironically proven its significance at the higher level. In general, the narrative of the Bible argues about humanity's conflicted attempt to reconcile spiritual truth with physical reality in the hopes of acquiring divine knowledge. For that reason, the ancient stories of the Bible Bible, will survive and eventually transcend any scientific discovery, as long as we recognize that level of interpretation.